Good morning on that side. So I'm speaking to Brian Ray this evening, and we're going to talk about um, research in homeschooling. Brian Ray is a seasoned researcher on home education. Um, and I think the first question I want to ask Brian is tell me more about your organization in HURI, National Home Education Research Institute.
Oh, good to see you, boy. Yep, NHERI. We call it NHERI, NHERI.org. It's very simple. We have been around since 1990, and before that, I was doing research on homeschooling and started a journal, The Homeschool Researcher, in 1985. That's a ways
Yeah.
ago. So the Homeschool Researcher has evolved into a peer-reviewed journal for the last many years. And we publish research by anybody if it makes it through the peer review process. So that's one thing that NHERI does. Basically, we're a research organization, so we do basic, I'll explain that means we do original research, collect data, analyze it, and report on it. We do that. We act as a clearinghouse of research, so research by anybody related to home-based education. We publish the journal, talk with the media, talk with the public, talk with families who are interested in homeschooling. So we're not really a homeschool support system, but we will take calls from parents who are interested in homeschooling and usually refer them to other people, but we can get into that later. So that's it. All things research related to home education, home-based education, homeschooling, whatever you want to call it.
Okay, and you've been around a while. Okay. So my first question is, if you look at research in the USA as well as international, what are the main reasons why parents choose home education?
Yeah, it's really been very consistent over 30 years or more. And I'm going to give these to you not in any particular order till I get to the end, but parents tell us in the research the main reasons for homeschooling are they want to provide a strong academic education for their children, and they think they can do at least as well as the public or government schools. They want to have more parent-directed social interaction. So rather than just turn their child over to a public school or private school for 12 years or so and with 25, 30 children they don't really know and let it rip for 12 years and see how it comes out, they want to guide their children a little bit more. They would like more family time. They think that if they have time together, they can build stronger relationships between parents and children, siblings, one another, those kinds of things. Parents also tell us that they want to be able to customize and individualize a curriculum for their children according to their strengths and needs and interests and desires and weaknesses. Let's see. They also tell us that they want a safer environment for their children, which would be anywhere from avoidance of violence to just a more relaxed, happier, psychologically healthy environment than in an institutional school. And they also tell us that, and I'm leaving this one last on purpose, that they believe that the parents should be the ones to teach values, beliefs, and worldview, that is philosophy and or religion to their children, rather than the government in government schools, and maybe even rather than private school teachers. One more thing that's come up, and maybe we'll get to this later, is that an increasing number of minority, in particular Black families, are saying that one of the reasons they want to homeschool is to keep their children away from experiences of racism by teachers and children in public schools. So those reasons have been very consistent over the years. The proportions of people who list any one of those reasons or a few of those reasons, or the proportion that list one is the most important, shifts and changes over time, over 5, 6, 7 years, but the reasons have been very stable overall for over 30 years.
So the top 10 stays the same, but then 1 and 2 maybe swap around sometime
Sure.
and so on. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I see that in my research, and I've seen it in the research of others. But overall, the ones I mentioned are in there somewhere as parents talk about why they homeschool. We also know from the research that parents might start homeschooling for one main reason. let's say, for example, that Billy is being bullied in school and the school cannot seem to do anything about it. So they take Billy out and say, let's homeschool him. But then after a couple months of homeschooling, they say, hey, you know, this is pretty nice. We have more family time. And actually, Billy is learning more academically. So they might start for one reason, say a reactive reason, but then later they develop and their reasons become more complex. So people might start for a couple of reasons proactively or never put their children in school. And then later, again, see some other reasons why homeschooling is good for their children.
That just makes you think sometimes parents take their children out of the school for a temporary reason. There is something at the school and they take their children out, but the idea is to homeschool and then later on put the child in a different school when they find a suitable school. And then does it often happen that they just continue homeschooling because they experience the benefits or their interests have changed?
Yes, that is definitely the case. More and more these days, in fact, the last 5 years or so, since homeschooling has become more popular in America and other countries and more socially accepted, parents can take it a little more lightly, the decision to do it. And so it might be like you said, hey, they see one reason, maybe Susie has an illness that's going to go on for a few months, and they say, hey, this would be really good if we homeschool her. We don't have to deal with getting in the car, getting on the bus, getting to school. It's because she's ill, long-term illness. But now after homeschooling for a couple months, they realize these other benefits. And so they just continue to homeschool. Yes, that happens all the time.
Okay. Okay, let's just move on to the next question. Does the research indicate that certain educational approaches, for example, a formula, grade-based curriculum, or unschooling, or classical, or unit studies, that the one is more successful than the other?
Good. Let me start with the overall answer. No. But now I'll give you a few nuances. Many people in the home education world realize that there are these different pedagogical approaches, different philosophical approaches, and within the homeschool community, they talk about things, for example, degree of structure, and they'll talk about at one end on the less structure, they'll talk about unschooling, or oftentimes people of the Christian faith will talk about relaxed homeschooling or lifestyle of learning. At the other end of the spectrum would be very, very structured, very much like a conventional institutional school. And then we have other things such as maybe the classical approach versus a great books approach versus a mentoring approach versus an apprenticeship approach. And what we see so far in the research is that I've done some of this myself. In fact, when I ask parents, at what age did you start formal instruction? And then how structured is your overall curriculum? And in a couple of nationwide studies I've done in the United States, we found basically zero correlation between those aspects and children's academic achievement as measured by standardized tests. Now, in one study out of Canada, Martin Chang and other colleagues did a study of relatively young children, about 9 years old, and they found that for the more structured homeschoolers, the children outperformed the public school average by quite a bit. They also found that the unschooling, as they were called, the less structured homeschooled children, were performing a little bit below average. Now, the researchers were very wise in pointing out these are very young children. They're only 9 years of age. And they said it's very possible that by the time these unschooled homeschooled children are 12, 13, 14, their scores might be on par or maybe even better than those in the public school. So I thought that was very wise of them to point that out. It's awfully early to make a decision about an approach at 9 years of age as a group. So far, not much correlation research finding between these different approaches and academic achievement.
Okay, thank you. There's recently been some disappointing news that homeschooling is not allowed in countries such as Cuba and China, and we obviously know about Germany and Sweden where it's verboten. But generally, is homeschooling still growing internationally despite these setbacks?
Yes, all the indications that I can see, both from research evidence and just talking with people in various nations and following homeschool leaders in America who work with people in other nations, it's definitely expanding. It's definitely growing. As you mentioned, in some particular countries, the governments are very antagonistic toward homeschooling. And in fact, oftentimes professional educators are antagonistic toward homeschooling. But what we've seen historically, unless it's a very tyrannical nation, eventually there's a breakthrough. And if enough grassroots pressure comes to bear on the government, usually they find some way to not prohibit home education. Now, whether that will happen in Cuba, I don't know. And Germany is to me, very fascinating, because on the one hand, the German people say that they're very progressive, they're very open to ideas, and yet they're clinging to a law that came to bear at the time of Hitler. And I don't say that lightly. That's what happened. So we don't know what's going to happen there, although I know it is being appealed in the courts, and the people are still working to change the mind of the government and the people there. So we're still seeing an expansion. Looking at something like China, again, you have something of a very oppressive government in some ways, and it's hard to know what's going to happen there. But I know there are people homeschooling, and I've talked with professors there, and I've been there, and it still seems to be expanding in spite of that kind of a government approach.
Okay. The next question is, how do homeschooling parents effectively decide on a curriculum during senior schooling years?
Yeah.
This is a question that came from one of the parents on one of our mailing lists.
Yes. I would say there are two things I would think of. Number one, if the family's already been home educating, if this particular student has already been homeschooled, then you have a history of what kinds of things work well, what keeps the attention of the learner, what helps this learner to succeed and do well academically and socially. So you have that record. You don't necessarily need to say, hey, let's change everything now that is in his senior years. And I would say, secondly, the young person and the parents need to look at, what are the goals? Are the objectives and the goals to continue in an academic environment such as university, or is a goal to get into some kind of hands-on mentorship or apprenticeship, or is it to go into the business world? So you have to keep those things in mind to decide where to go. For many home educated youth, by the time they're 16 years old, they already have a good command of the basics of reading, writing, arithmetic, maybe through algebra or pre-algebra, and many of them are ready to go into a workforce. So I think you need to keep all those things in mind, and I would recommend that parents who are facing that talk with other experienced homeschoolers to find out what are some of the options. Those are the main things. If a person's thinking about going on to university, I know in the United States they need to keep some good records, they need to have a transcript ready, and they probably need to take a college admissions test such as the SAT or the ACT. So that's why I say you need to know what the goals are and the objectives.
Yeah, I think there is a question later about the matric, as we call it in South Africa. That is the school leaving certificate.
Yes.
Another thing related to this is there are, in South Africa especially, we've got the government curriculum, which is called CAPS. Curriculum and Assessment. I can't remember the entire abbreviation, but
Yes.
it's outcomes, sort of an outcomes-based curriculum. Defines for every grade and every subject the outcomes and what must be done in order to prove that the outcome has been achieved.
Yes.
And it goes into the finest detail, and it prescribes up to the hour of what a teacher in a public school should do. And the homeschooling curriculum providers, a lot of them also pride themselves on the fact that their curriculums are CAPS compliant.
Yes.
And the reason why they think it's good that a homeschooling curriculum is CAPS compliant is because they say, if you start homeschooling and you follow a CAPS compliant curriculum and you want to go back to school later on, it will be easier to go back into school.
Mm-hmm.
What is your opinion? Would it be easier to follow a homeschooling curriculum that's aligned with the public school curriculum to make it easier to go back later? Or can do homeschoolers that follow a totally different curriculum easily go back into the public schools? And it can happen that your circumstances change, that you have to send your children to a public school. What's your opinion?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, my opinion is it raises a lot of questions. and I think the first and most important questions are philosophical, and that is parents and young adults need to decide, why are we home educating? And if they believe that they're home educating because it's the right thing to do based on some philosophy or religious beliefs, then that's what you do. And you're not always trying to find out or wait for maybe the sky will fall. Like, oh no, the sky's going to fall. You do what you're supposed to do because it's good. And secondly, it raises the question: is there anything good about home education is different or better from institutional schooling? And the answer is there are many things that are better about home-based education than institutional schooling. So take advantage of those things. And I would say to most people, don't worry about trying to be consistent with or comply with the government school system. Okay, I'm not being practical yet, am I? So then I would say, finally, the argument that you kind of laid out there theoretically almost implies that in some people's mind, the public school or government school system is the default system, the best system, the normal system, and normal is good, Bowie. But people have to start to question. People have to question that kind of assumption. Now, finally, on a little bit more practical note, and remember, practical is not better than philosophical necessarily. If people are already intending to put their children in institutional school when they start homeschooling, well, then maybe you need to think about that and try to follow all the government rules and all the government mandated curriculum. But now I'll say a final thing. My experience is that most children who are home educated, if they're being given a solid academic training, and most of them are, they're going to do just fine in the government schools in the United States and probably in South Africa. Okay, you do not have to constantly focusing on what some expert professional over there says is the curriculum god of the world. You don't have to worry about that so much. If your children are learning to read and hopefully enjoy reading, if they're learning to be critical thinkers by discussing things with you and reading solid literature, if they're learning basic mathematics and you're teaching them how to write a good single-page essay, it's very, very likely they can make a fine transition into institutional schooling if that's where you go someday.
It's also interesting, you make me think now, is if you follow the government curriculum at home, is the government curriculum is designed for a school, and therefore it does not work very well in home education. And I can give you an example. Like in a school environment, you quickly want a test. You want to do a test. So the teacher comes and hands out the tests, everybody writes. Half an hour later, she collects the answer sheets, she marks them, and after an hour, the whole assessment is done. If you do that over distance education, then you must send out the test documents on a certain day, and it must be received back, and you must put get it to the right persons to mark them, and it's something that's very quick in a school, is very difficult in a homeschooling environment, and therefore following the government curriculum often is a failure in a homeschool environment. Is that
it can very much be. It can be very much that way. And we've found in the United States, I've talked with many homeschool families and homeschool leaders in different states of the 50 states. And what they're seeing is that when the government starts providing what we call a public school at home program, it's a distance program. It's literally funded by the taxes, and therefore it's controlled by the government, but you can do it in the home Some of these people think they're homeschoolers, but they're really not. They're public school at home families. And they have to follow this curriculum top down. And the children, in many cases, become less interested. Learning is not as enjoyable. The scores in the tests are not as high as in the regular home education or even in the public schools. So there's something about it that does not lead to a lot of good things. I guess what I like to say to parents who have the joy and the opportunity of home education and choose it is, why have a government system run and press your life rather than the interests and the needs of your family and your children direct the education of your children? You know, it's a very different approach to learning and teaching that I think is one of the beautiful things about home education.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. The next question. Yeah, it looks like every question leads to another a few sub questions. So we are 3 questions further now. In the meantime, which are the top 3 things that homeschooling parents do differently from mainstream teachers? And why can an uncertified parent obtain the same and better results than certified teachers?
The first thing I think of, Bowie, is that the very, very basic nature of home education is that it makes available the customization and individualization of the education for a child in the context of his particular family. There's just no way to get around that. And some homeschool families do better at it, some do worse, but it's available. Okay, so whether your child is, quote, average, whatever that means, or whether your child is a slow learner, whatever that means, or whether your child is a fast learner or talented and gifted, or whatever that means, whether your child is interested in being a pig farmer or a carpenter or an auto mechanic or an accountant, you can develop an environment, pick a curriculum that fits that child and simultaneously fits the style and the interests of the parents at the same time. That might sound a little bit strange, but it's a customized education. In a government school or a private school, you better accept the fact that it's pretty much a one-size-fits-all approach. Okay, so that's at the core. That's at the core of home education. And I like to call it parent-led, home-based education, and that helps people to get a grasp a little bit better of what it's all about. The second thing is that parents, by their very nature, know and understand the student, which happens to be the child, much better than anybody usually. And a corollary of that is that when you home educate, there's a large amount of social capital involved. And sociologist James Coleman found that social capital was one of the main reasons why private school children do better on average than public school children. And social capital has to do with trust, relationship, consistency of worldview. So that's the second thing I think of. And then the third thing that I think of that homeschooling parents can do and offer different from a mainstream situation is that in home education, children are receiving an age-integrated education. They're interacting with people of various ages. They are becoming adult-oriented, and they're involved in normal real-life activities, whereas in public school, private school, it's age segregated. They become more peer dependent, and they're actually in artificial activities that people usually only do for about 12 years, and then they change and they become adults. So I think these are 3 of the main things that home education parents can do that conventional school teachers do not get to do. It's not because they're bad teachers, but their environment does not allow it, basically.
I just want to hook on the first statement that you make, that parents naturally tend to do things in the interest of the child because they know the child better. Now, there's currently a court case going in South Africa, and it's about religious observances in public schools. But it's in South Africa, public schools are are governed jointly by the government, but also a parent, a body, a corporate, a parent management committee. So the parents elect a committee, and that parent representative organization has got certain says. And one of the things they can determine is, let's say, religious policy. And there's currently in that court case an argument about who can decide best what's in the best interest of the child, the government or parents. And we often assume that it's the parents, but it increasingly has been questioned by governments or undermined by governments. What are the arguments to say that the parents know what's in the best of the interest of the child better than officials?
Sure. Well, reflecting on that, first of all, in the United States, clearly the government does not think the parents know best when it comes to public schools. That's out the window. We have a legal concept here called in loco parentis, in place of the parents. And from what I read of history and watching the last 40 years or so, clearly once a child is handed over by the parents to the government or public schools, the parents have almost no say over a child's life for 6 hours per day. So that's pretty clear here. You asked what arguments are they? We could either take an agnostic approach to this, and I'm not an agnostic, and say, well, based on evolution, children are born to parents, so we should just allow the parents to be in charge of the children. That would be one argument. Another argument would be, well, we live in a democracy, and we have democratism, which means a worship of democracy. Basically, that means, the 51%, the tiny majority, gets to control the minority. I don't agree with that one either. But if we take a theistic perspective, and I happen to be a Christian, then we take the perspective that God gives to the parents the authority to make the basic decisions about a child's education and upbringing. If we have that set of presuppositions, then we say the parent knows best, and the parent should be allowed to do that, and the government should not interfere. Now, some people say, oh, that's just a religious perspective, but I want to point out what I alluded to earlier. Democratism is also a religious perspective. It has presuppositions of values, belief, and worldview that says the government, which happens to be the majority, is the God. Okay, so you've got at least a couple of choices, and I would go with that last one. When you have children in the public schools, whether you have a parent committee or not, or you have a parental input or not, let's face it, Bowie, somebody's going to make a decision, and it's often going to not please or go along with the interests or the needs of a large portion of families and children. That's one of the problems with government schooling in a free country, is that you will always crush the rights or the interests of certain people. That's what happens. Even though we say it's reached by a democratic process, it will crush the interests and the rights of some people.
And the same argument is applicable to the private school. So you've got a private school, and let's say the parents of the private school choose a committee, and that committee makes a decision, and there might be a minority of parents that do not agree with certain of those decisions. And so you've got exactly the same problem with private school.
Certainly, it's the same exact thing, and that's one of the reasons that I'm very happy when a nation does not prohibit home-based education. Home-based education is really the only pure freedom space in terms of freedom of conscience for families, parents raising their children that we have. Public schools are not. Private schools you choose, but let's face it, you'll run into the same kind of problem. And in fact, what we have in many cases historically in the United States, and I'm sure in other nations, a school will start out with a particular philosophy and or worldview, and parents put their children in it, and a few years later, it's going a different direction. The parents don't even notice it, and suddenly it becomes actually antithetical to what the parents are trying to teach their children. This happens over and over again at the elementary, secondary level. It happens over and over again at the university level.
Okay, let's move on. A question here, how successful are homeschooling kids after school compared to mainstream kids? What proportion of home educated children go on to pursue independent livelihoods like farmers, business owners, entrepreneurs, freelance writers, etc.? And does that number vary considerably across countries?
Yeah, well, I will have to admit that I am a little bit Amerocentric here. And by far the most research has been done in the United States on home education. And when I say home education, I mean the modern home education movement, the last 35 or 40 years. What we know so far is that on average, the home educated go on to college or university at about the same rate or a little higher rate than the general public. That's about what we know right now. We also know from empirical studies that once at university, they're typically doing as well and often better in terms of grade point average, test scores, and those kinds of things than those who went to at least public schools. So we're gathering more research on that. Not many studies, but several studies. We also know that, again, there's not a lot of research on this, but what we have so far suggests that those who are home educated, when they get into the world of vocation and occupation, they tend to be a little more entrepreneurial. They tend to be more involved in self-employment and independent kinds of businesses. Not huge disproportions, but it seems pretty obvious. I remember, this is not research, but this was an alumni magazine for Stanford University in California. They had a cover story on homeschool students at Stanford. And the admissions officer said that one of the main things they notice about home educated young people who come to Stanford is that they have a lot of self-initiative, which means they've already learned how to do a lot of things on their own and they go for it without being prodded and pushed. So overall, there is a slightly to a little more positive report from research on adults who are home educated, whether they go on to college or whether they go into more of the workforce after their secondary years.
Okay, thank you.
And by the way, I don't know of anything different in other nations. I cannot say that there's much research, but I've never heard anything that's different than that.
Yeah, okay. Recently, a South African provincial education minister, Minister Lesufi of the Gauteng province, has made a statement, and I'll send you the video, you've seen it, that yes, there was a sudden increase in home education in South Africa, and he gave 3 reasons for that. 1, parents do not want their children to integrate with broader society. 2, parents do not want their children to mix with other children. And 3, parents want to replace teachers. What is your reaction to those assertions?
Well, first of all, I would want to know what are the premises for his assertions, and my hunch is he has none, because I haven't found it, I haven't heard of it, I haven't seen it. Secondly, I will respond to those assertions based on the research that I know, which is the research I've been following for over 30 years. There's no empirical evidence to support his sweeping claims. He would have to get much more nuanced if he even wanted to come close to reality. Second of all, research and my experience with hundreds, if not thousands of I would say thousands of homeschool families now, show that they do mix with a variety of people and institutions in their communities and out beyond their communities. On that note, it's kind of interesting. In the United States, many people thought or hoped that once we had the desegregation of public schools in America, there would be maybe like a heaven on earth, or there'd be more integration of race, ethnicity. And now we find the last 10 years, public schools are becoming even more racially segregated in many places, which is just the opposite of what some people had hoped for when the government forced integration. I'm not trying to say which is good or bad here. I'm just giving an observation. So first of all, research shows that homeschool families and children do mix with a variety of people and institutions. Second of all, it's kind of an interesting claim that they want homeschoolers want parents to replace teachers. I would say uh, they're not replacing teachers. Parents are teachers. Parents are the first teachers of children. They have been for thousands of years. So it's kind of a strange concept to say that they want to replace teachers. Secondly, if by teachers he means government certified teachers, I would say that research shows us that homeschool families do use professional certified teachers if they think that would be best for their children. Sometimes they hire certified teachers. Sometimes they're in cooperatives with other people who are certified teachers. So I don't think they're trying to necessarily avoid professional teachers. Home educators are just not choosing government controlled institutions where most people are certified teachers. That's different from saying they're trying to avoid or replace teachers. So those are the main things I would say. Oftentimes when people make claims like this, this person did in South Africa, they're trying to like use innuendo or negative comments about homeschoolers. In fact, for example, in the United States, I remember over 20 years ago, I heard some individuals and at least one professor, university professor, claimed that home education was a form of white flight. That was white people trying to get away from black people or Hispanic people. In over 33 years of following research and meeting families, I think I met one person who was promoting anything like that. And I've met thousands and thousands of homeschoolers. I've met hundreds of vendors who sell products. I've met homeschool leaders from all over the world, and I found one in 33 years. So I think that this minister there in South Africa is sort of possibly making up kinds of ideas and claims out of just out of the blue, out of the air.
That also leads to another question for me is we often have the situation where when the media wants to write a story or on home education, they always try to show both sides. Okay, home education has got lots of benefits, but there are also a number of disadvantages that you have to take into account. And then they often interview a psychologist.
Oh, yeah.
And these psychologists usually know nothing about home education, but they've got lots of opinions about it. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that these psychologists often say is that parents often struggle. On the one side, they must be a parent, and on the other side, they must be a teacher, and there's often a conflict between these things, and that is then described as a problem of home education.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what's your opinion about that?
Bowie, I've heard this claim for over 30 years. First of all, it's a false dichotomy. Let's again think back whether a person is an evolutionist and thinks that somehow human beings, Homo sapiens, emerged from a primate, ape-like creature millions of years ago, or whether a person thinks that human beings appeared as human beings maybe thousands of years ago. It doesn't matter which. Parents have always been teachers. That's what they are. If we look at from either perspective, parents teach their offspring. That is a core function. It is a basic function of being a Homo sapiens parent. So it's a false dichotomy, first of all. Second of all, I think these psychologists forget history, and they forget that home-based education has actually been the norm for most of written history on human beings. And institutional schooling, especially institutional schooling with government certified teachers, is a little blip in history. If we look at the United States, it's a little blip in history. If we look at South Africa or Europe, it's a blip in history. So these psychologists are ignoring thousands of years of human history, and they come up with this false dichotomy. Maybe the reason that they have this dichotomy in their heads is that that's what they experienced growing up in institutional schools. The certified teacher was the expert and knows way more than mom and dad do. And the certified teacher is the one you're supposed to obey and respect for 6 hours per day. And then when you're coming home and you run into mom and dad, it's a whole different world. And maybe they're only in charge of your diet when you're home and which TV shows you watch when you're home. So now there's this false dichotomy about what is the role and the function and the sphere of influence of a parent versus a government certified teacher. I really believe it's a false dichotomy. And if people go along with that idea and they think that, oh, 6-7 hours per day, a child is supposed to honor and obey the government certified teacher, and then other parts of the week he's supposed to honor and obey and respect only the parents, yes, you could come up with a conflict in your mind about what those two roles are. But when people home educate or they never put their children in public school or private school, it's a very smooth, regular, normal, natural transition, and most people don't really think about it that much.
Okay, thank you. Social cohesion is very important in South Africa, given the history of South Africa. And the question is, in these discussions, the question is often asked, is there any research on the extent to which home education contributes towards social cohesion?
Well, I think we need to form a new question, Bowie. Is there any research on the extent to which government-run schooling contributes to social cohesion? So sometimes we just need to answer a question with a question. And I would look at it this way. I cannot speak with any authority on South Africa, but I can guess some things. But I'm going to look at the United States for a minute. We have now had, it was not until about 1900 that we had the majority of children in what we would now call public schooling in America with government approved, government certified teachers. That's not a long time ago. But then even when we got to 1900, the children were only in these schools for a few months per year and sometimes only a few hours per day. And of course it evolves so that eventually now we have 87% of children 5 days a week, 9 months per year in public government schools with certified teachers. And if this kind of environment were conducive to causing social, positive, interpersonal relationships, then it seems like we would expect heaven on earth in America. But then I ask people in America, I ask professors, I ask judges in courts, I ask psychologists, are you happy with the illiteracy rates in America? Are you happy with the rates of alcohol abuse by seniors in high school in America? Are you happy with the drug abuse by seniors in high school in America? Are you happy with the incarceration rates in America? Are you happy with the bullying rates in American public and private schools? Are you happy with the teen pregnancy rates? Just go down a long list of what most people would think of as negative behaviors. And almost nobody will say that they're happy with all of those rates. Are you happy with the rate of being a part of gangs? Are you happy with the racism rates? If public schools somehow made all of these things far better, then we should be very, very happy with how things are in the United States. But most people are not on those things. So I would say that we have no empirical evidence that being in an institutional school for 6 hours per day is significantly increasing social cohesion. Now, on the other side, I believe personally, based on experience, being an educator, a professor of education, a classroom teacher, a father, a person involved in my community, that when individual children are taught the value and that they should be respectful and tolerant of everybody else, regardless of race, ethnicity, religious beliefs, political beliefs. And when children get that down deep in their spirits and they kind of grasp that and take it on as their own by the time they're 16, 17, 18 years old, they're the ones who will be promoting and being a part of socially cohesive places. That's what I see. I have a personal example. I went to private schools in Portland, Oregon. I won't say which denomination. I never met a black person until I was in high school, I don't think. And in my high school, which was not small, we had 2 black students. I would venture and I would hypothesize that anybody could take a random sample of the graduates of my high school and a random sample of public school graduates from Portland, Oregon, and they would find that the graduates of the private school I attended would be far less racist and more tolerant of other people than the graduates of the public schools. I'm confident in that. It's because of what they were taught on a consistent basis and what was modeled by the teacher and what was enforced in the student behavior in the school. So the same kind of things applies to home education. We have some evidence, not a lot. There was one study, this excellent study done recently by an Albert Cheng, and he found when he compared public school graduates, private school graduates, and homeschool graduates who are at the university level, the homeschool graduates actually were more politically tolerant than the others. It was incredible. It was the opposite of what the negative critics of home education thought would happen.
That's fascinating. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's a question here about matric, but I'm going to skip that one. Another question is, if you could give 3 tips to new homeschooling parents, what would it be?
Yeah. The first thing is, if they're new and they're trying to learn and they're humble, and I hope they are, they should talk with a variety of veteran homeschool families, whether they've been homeschooling 1 year, 3 years, 20 years, from a variety of backgrounds and approaches to home education, but who share their basic philosophy / worldview / religion, and just ask questions and discuss things, discuss curriculum, discuss child training, discuss approaches to discipline. And by that, I do not necessarily mean corporal punishment. I just mean discipline, in lives, in the parents' lives, in the children's lives. Discuss why they home educate and learn from those people. It can be very, very encouraging and instructive. The second thing I would say is if you meet anybody who says there is one best way to home educate, run away from them really fast. Because one of the beauties, as I talked about earlier, of home education is that you can develop I would call it a constellation of pedagogy and instruction and learning that fits the family, the parents, the children. And that's going to be very special for each family. So that's why I say talk with a variety of people, get ideas. And the third thing I would say is that, and this is easier for people who never put their children in public schools or private schools. It's a little harder for people who had their children in public or private schools. Relax and just relax and try not to let the pressures and the expectations of the world and professional educators and your parents, that's your children's grandparents, don't let all those pressures make you stressed out and worried about things. I've told a lot of people that if you simply, let's say your children are youngish, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, if you just read aloud to them some really interesting and fun and enjoyable rich books a half hour per day, and you did basic math with them, like little booklets from we would say here in America, from Walmart, and if you just had them write, practice writing letters to grandma and their aunts and uncles, they would probably do very well. And then you can start adding the more complicated things. But I just want to encourage people to relax and enjoy being with their children.
Great, thank you. The next one is the trends in home education are probably lagging in the USA. We are sort of, I think, 20 years behind, most probably. What do you recognize as the current trends in home education?
Yeah, what I see is that the United States is, I guess I would have to say, ahead of most nations, or maybe all nations, in terms of the modern homeschool movement. We have a tradition, of we want to be the land of the free and the home of the brave. We've fallen down in a lot of areas there, I'd have to say, with a lot of socialism and so forth, but I won't get into that right now. we do have, my best estimate now is about 2.4 million K-12, kindergarten through 12th grade homeschool children in America. And every year it's growing. It's been growing since the late 70s. That's tremendous growth no matter how you look at it. To go from almost zero, one researcher thinks 15,000 or so in the 70s, but to now over 2 million, up to 2.4 million. That's tremendous growth politically, socially, statistically, however you look at it. And I think that we're going to continue to see growth because those foundational reasons for homeschooling are very strong that I mentioned earlier. They keep driving parents, they keep driving teenagers to want to home educate. I would say that we also see, because of the success of homeschooling in the United States, it's more popular. People have easier access to it. There's more curriculum than anybody could ever want or need. If somebody has the internet access already paid for that, they have basically free curriculum available now with something like Khan Academy, KHAN. By the way, I'm not a part of that, but you can go there and you can start your math with 1 + 1 and you can work your way up into trigonometry. It's just absolutely incredible. So the resources are myriad. And then we have one more thing here and beginning in other nations. We have now graduates of home education who are married and have children or are homeschooling their children. And my research and others shows that they're going to homeschool at a higher rate than their parents homeschooled. So I think we're going to continue to see significant growth in home education in the United States. If other nations have even similar cultures and access and a lack of government prohibition, they're going to see similar growth. I don't know if it'll ever be as high a percent as in the United States, but they're going to continue to grow in home education in those nations, except where it's prohibited or where it's really, really a struggle to do it. So I see, I'm not a big predictor kind of researcher kind of guy, but I see continued growth for many years of home education in the United States and many other nations.
Yeah, my understanding is that in the USA, the percentage of homeschoolers is about 2 to 3% of the total school-going population. Is that correct?
No, it's higher than that. We think it's now more like 3 to 4%. Okay. So that might not sound like a lot, but the difference between you just quoted and what I quoted is a major change. But we think it's approaching 4% of the school-age population. And another way to look at this, Bowie, is that home education now, if I know my statistics right, I think I'm close. There are more children in homeschooling than in Roman Catholic schools in America. And the Roman Catholic schools some years ago got up to be about 5 million. But the Roman Catholic has gone down, homeschooling's up. And so that's a major change. We also have in the United States what are called charter schools, which are public schools, but there are fewer government controls on them. Homeschooling is almost as big as the charter schools, which is a major growth in America. So that's where we are right now.
Have you got any ideas of how far it can go? I read something, I think, by Michael Smith or something from the HSLBA. Yes. I think he estimated it can go up to 10%. Is there any reason to believe that it will be limited to 10%, or can it become 90%?
I think, okay, so let's back up a little bit in my research life. Before my doctorate in science education, I was a pure science guy, and I was in biology, zoology, and environmental science and ecology. So I think of limiting factors. I think of growth factors and limiting factors. And if if all we had were growth factors, such as does home education help children learn a lot? Yes. Is home education systemically, naturally conducive to customization and individualization? Yes. Does home education have a small class size? Yes. Does home education involve a lot of social capital? Yes. Does home education reduce distractions of being in a peer group and offers of drugs? And yes, we could look at all these positive growth factors, but let's look at some other things, the limiting factors. To be honest, how many parents want to spend that kind of time with their children? That's a very serious question, and I'm not trying to lay out guilt trips, but the truth is many parents do not want to spend that kind of time with their children. How many parents enjoy the concept in the United States when the end of the summer comes and they get to send their children away to government school? They like that. Okay, so we would have to have a change in the thinking of parents to value time with their children, to see it not as a struggle and this big demand, but a good thing, a valuable thing. We have another limiting factor, and that is how many. Okay, so I would concede that some families would not be able to live on one income, for example, of a single parent and homeschool. And so society would have to change in terms of how many single parent families we have. But then I'll say this one that's more philosophical. We have many parents who are not willing to choose to live on one income. They would rather have 2 nice automobiles. They would rather have 2 nice vacations per year. They would rather do that than spend the time with their children in homeschooling. So we do have limiting factors. To get to your question, could we reach 10%? I think we could. Do we go beyond that? I don't know. But I think it would be a major sociological and political impact and a philosophical impact on the United States if we were to ever reach even 5% of the school-age population, because those families and their graduates have a disproportionate effect on society. And I think it's a good one.
Okay, I think, yeah, I sort of automatically asked the last question, and that is about the percentage. I think just another one on the numbers is, I think I've read something that's an article that says in the USA, there was a bit of a lag of the take-off of home education on the African Americans. And they've now, homeschooling is now taken off in that community, and it's actually now the fastest growing part of home education.
There's some evidence of that last part. Clearly, in the early years of the modern homeschool movement, it was disproportionately white Anglo in the United States. And we have statistical evidence of that. Starting around 10 years ago, this is anecdotal. I know when I was traveling in the United States, I started noticing an upturn in the number of faces of color who I saw in audiences at homeschool conferences. And statistics bear out now that the disproportionality is reduced. And I think the last time the federal government researchers did some work, over 15% of families who homeschool are not white Anglo in the United States. And yes, we see a tremendous growth amongst Black families. You see these African American families in some places. For example, in what's called Prince George's County around Washington, D.C., there are support groups of 20, 30, 40 families, all Black families, homeschooling in that area. So we're seeing it in anecdotes, we're seeing it at conferences, and we're seeing it in the research statistics, and talking with different homeschool organization leaders all across America. There are a lot of Black families moving toward homeschooling.
Brian Ray, thank you very much. I think it was, I really enjoyed this interview, and I want to sincerely thank you for your time and also your tremendous patience that you demonstrated while we were trying to sort out the technical problems. So thank you very much.
You're welcome, Boy. I enjoyed it very much.